Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 189. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, October the 3rd, from the James Strong Studio in western St. Charles County. Had some technical problems this morning with I'm still not sure what it was. I should have started the podcast over half an hour ago, but I don't know if the problem was with the microphone. I don't know if the problem was with the cords, the mixer box, or what. But after swapping lots of stuff around, I think we have the broadcast quality that I'm going to be happy with. As I've said before, if I had done nothing, you probably would have never been able to tell what the problem was, but I would have. And being the anal retentive individual that I am, I had to fix that problem before we proceeded with the podcast. So yes, I have. So now we can. The podcast this morning is going to be about the state of the podcast. In other words, where we're going, what we're doing, where we're going with the podcast, and how the podcast has progressed throughout the years, how it differs from the old James Strong Show terrestrial radio program, and what we're going to be doing moving forward. Not a whole lot different, by the way, so I'm not going to whet your appetite. Stay tuned for big time news, and then 40 minutes into the podcast, you're disappointed because it's not a big change. There's not big changes coming to the podcast, but there's little subtle changes as we've done throughout the whole podcast. From terrestrial radio to the Good Life Show to the James Strong Show podcast. Before I proceed with the podcast, I did want to take a moment just to mention the passing of Cardinal baseball star Bob Gibson. I heard that news this morning. I understood he passed away last night from pancreatic cancer. Bob Gibson was, in my opinion, the greatest baseball player to ever live. Now you think to yourself, well, come on, Strong. That's kind of a strong statement. I mean, Babe Ruth, Henry Aaron, Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire. There have been lots of ball players who were probably better than Bob Gibson. And to that I say, no, I don't think so. And here's why I say that. Back in 1969, Major League Baseball changed the rules because of Bob Gibson. Bob Gibson had the 1.13 ERA back in 1968. And they changed the rules because he dominated batters to a point where they didn't think that the batters could compete against Bob Gibson. So they lowered the mound. He's the only baseball player in history where they changed the rules because he was too good. Let that sink in for just a moment. And as far as being a competitor, I will tell you one quick story, and this was a story that Tim McCarver tells about Bob Gibson. For many years, Tim McCarver was his battery mate. He caught a lot of Gibson's ball games. And as happens with pitchers and catchers during the game, if the catcher notes that the pitcher's having a problem, if he can't hit his spots, if he's has confusion with the signs, if they can't get on the same page, if there's just a situation they want to discuss, the catcher goes to the mound. Well, apparently Gibson wasn't having the greatest game, so McCarver called time and went out to talk to Gibson. As McCarver approached the mound, Gibson said, "What are you going to tell me? The only thing you know about pitching is that you can't hit it. Now get back behind the plate." McCarver bowed his head and went back behind the plate. That, my friends, was Bob Gibson. Bob Gibson, rest in peace. As I said before, this is podcast number 189. 189 podcasts I've done since my exit from terrestrial radio. Lots and lots of podcasts, okay? Between the terrestrial radio show, my shows on WGNU, the Good Life show, I've talked about lots of topics, interviewed lots of people, taken lots of phone calls, discussed lots and lots of things. And broadcasting, radio, in fact, I've mentioned, I still think I do radio, even though I'm not on a terrestrial broadcast, because radio to me is the vehicle, not necessarily the appliance. Radio is the audio tool that you use to get your point across, to entertain, to inform, okay? That's what radio is to me. And I've done 189 of these podcasts, and I hope to be doing a whole lot more. That's the plan, okay? And you can get all the podcasts starting from 2017, July 2017. That's podcast number 40, okay? Podcast number 40 is from July 2017. 40 through 189 are all on Spreaker. Spreaker.com. You can just go to Spreaker.com and look at all, and search James Strong Show, and there's all the podcasts, 40 through 189. It's a lot of podcasts. You can go ahead and take a look through the equipment changes, to the audio quality, to the topic changes. Subtle little changes, not big changes, but certainly I think things have gotten better. I hope they have anyway. That's the goal. But again, take a look at all the different podcasts, and people do this, okay? People do this. They'll listen to podcasts from 1, 2, 3 years ago sometimes, and they pop up on my statistics. And as I mentioned before, Spreaker is my vehicle. That's where I host the podcasts, Spreaker.com. But let me get these stats here. I did want to run over some statistics. Spreaker's an interesting outfit. The way it works is I record the podcast. I store it on my computer here, and it's also stored on a micro SD disk, and then it's also stored on the website at Spreaker.com. So I have the podcasts on 3 different sources. The podcast you listen to is on Spreaker.com. Okay, and it's downloaded into a MP3 format to make it a little bit smaller. The actual live broadcast is recorded in a WAV file, which the broadcast quality is a tad better. You really can't tell the difference. I can, but a WAV file is just too big to download to Spreaker. So I dumb it down to an MP3, and then you can pick it up on Spreaker.com. A lot of people pick it up via Spreaker, via different sources as well, different podcast sites. But one of the other things that Spreaker does for me, for a fee, they charge a fee to host the podcast, but they also, for that same fee, they give me information as to who, what, where, when, why, and how. Maybe not. Yeah, how. Maybe not why. People listen to this podcast. They give me numbers. They give me statistics. And I find these statistics amazing. I've always been a big fan of statistics. And this, the Spreaker, the broadcast and the Spreaker host gives me that information. And you can always make an assumption as to who listens to the podcast, what people like, what they want to listen to. You can make those assumptions, okay? But maybe, just maybe, those assumptions are wrong. So I'm going to share some of the numbers with you, and I'm going to share them in the last 7 days and the last 30 days. And then we'll talk a little bit about what I think they mean. Let's look at the last 7 days, okay? Of the downloads and listenings, people that listen to this podcast, 86% of them were from the United States, 9% from Australia, 5% from India, 6%, less than 1% from Romania, Mexico, India, Ireland, okay? That's the mix as to who's listening to the podcast just in the last 7 days. In the last 30 days, similar but not the same. In the last 30 days, 89% of all listeners have been from the United States, and that's pretty steady. U.S. listenership is usually between 80 and 90%, which kind of makes sense, okay? I'm based in the U.S. Most of our topics are about U.S. topics, so it would just make sense that most of our listeners are here in the good old U.S. of A. But 30 days ago, 2% were from Australia, 1% from India, 6% in the Russian Federation, and less than 1% Romania, Mexico, India, Ireland, and there's a couple others thrown in during the last 30 days. Just one here, one there. What does that mean? Well, listenership in India has bumped up, and I don't find that as surprising because I'm new on the number one podcast download site in India. It's called JioSavan. And I've done some minor promoting on that download site, JioSavan. So naturally, we have people in India who listen to the James Strong Show podcast. I made the assumption that people from India listen to the James Strong Show podcast because we had the podcast a couple of weeks ago with Jerome Koenigsfeld, and that was his adventures throughout India. However, India shows up more in the last 7 days than they did 30 days, okay, as a percentage of listenership. So what does that mean? Well, people listened more this week than they did the last 20 days. Jerome's podcast was almost 2 weeks ago. So again, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that maybe they downloaded it a week or two after it was recorded. Because remember, that's the thing about a podcast. It's not real time. In fact, it's definitely not real time. This is not a live podcast. Even when I'm done with this, when I mix it, fix it, and then drop it to Spreaker, email it to you, and if it pops up on your email immediately and you download it and listen to it immediately, it's more than an hour old. Okay, so it's not real time. So you may listen to this podcast an hour after it dropped, or an hour after it recorded, I should say. Or you may listen to this podcast a day, a week, a month, a year after it was recorded. And there's not much of a way for me to tell who listened to what and when. Which individual podcast and when. Could I get more statistics from Spreaker? Yeah, but I have to pay them a little bit more money. And you can tell by by the sponsors that that advertise on this show, there's none, how much money I make on this podcast right now. So I'm only willing to open my pocket so much, so big for so much. The list of sources for the James Strong Show. Well, let's go back to statistics. We'll talk about sources in a minute, but let's talk about the stats. We talked about who listens and in which countries. In the U.S., in the last 7 days, 57% of all listeners were from the city of St. Louis or St. Louis City and County, okay? Which isn't surprising because James Gray Falcon was the last guest on the podcast, and the Gray Falcon is he's big in the city. He's big in St. Louis County. And he has a big following there. So that makes sense that 57% of all U.S. listeners were from St. Louis. Florida, just under 10%. U.S. St. Louis suburbs, just under 10%. Washington, Missouri, that area, the whole Washmo area, about 4%. St. Charles County, 4%. And then New York State, Virginia, South Carolina, and others, about 3%. And there's some fringe ones in there, just one listener here and there. That's in the last 7 days. Last 30 days, a little bit different. Last 30 days, I had 12% of my listeners were from the Chicago area, Illinois and the Chicago area. In the last 7 days, none from the Chicago area. Outstate Missouri, 16% in the last 30 days, but none in the last 7. So interesting stats. Different people listen at different times and to different shows. Why is that? Don't know for sure. But I do know I have spikes in areas, spikes in listenership. I'll have spikes in individual shows. And